2 summers ago, I took that iconic family vacation to the Grand Canyon. It was the first time my children or I had ever been there. On the afternoon that we arrived, we began our hike thick in the woods. After about a mile, we arrived at the north rim of the canyon, and all of a sudden, the forest thinned out, the ground fell away, and the full grandeur of the canyon came into view. It just took my breath away. The canyon seemed to snake on forever in the horizon, and there were bands of vivid color stacked up like a layer cake. And I turned to my teenage son and I exclaimed, "Can you believe the beautiful handiwork of God?" To which he replied, "I think that's called erosion, Mom." It was clear I had failed. Now, I probably shouldn't take it so personally. He's certainly not the only teenager who doesn't readily see God in the world. But as someone in the God business, it hit hard. How do I talk about God in a way that could make sense to my determinedly rational, science-oriented son? Now, these questions of reconciling God and science are not new, and I know they're not just particular for Jews. I came upon the most delightful letter that was written in January of 1936 by a young girl named Phyllis from the Riverside Church. She asked this question on behalf of her Sunday school class. She wrote, "My dear Dr. Einstein, we have brought up the question, do scientists pray, in my Sunday school class. It began asking whether we could believe in both science and religion. We would feel greatly honored if you will answer our question. Do scientists pray, and what do they pray for? We are in the 6th grade, Miss Ellis's class. Respectfully yours, Phyllis." Only 5 days later, Einstein wrote back to her. "Dear Phyllis," he wrote, "scientists believe that every occurrence, including the affairs of human beings, are due to the laws of nature. Therefore, a scientist cannot be inclined to believe that the course of events can be influenced by prayer, that is, by a supernaturally manifested wish. But also, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that some spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, one that is vastly superior to that of man. In this way, the pursuit of science leads to a religious feeling of a special sort, which is surely quite different from the religiosity of someone more naive. With cordial greetings, your A. Einstein." Now, my first thought upon seeing that letter was like, wow, you Riverside have some Sunday school. Next, I thought, well, how cool was that? Little Phyllis writing to this great scientist. We Jews call that chutzpah. And that this brilliant scientist, one of the greatest of all time, affirmed that anyone who is seriously looking at the laws of the universe only becomes more convinced that there is a force behind it all that is greater than beyond all of our comprehension. We know that human beings have been asking these questions about God for millennia. And yet, in this growing age of secularism, where the fastest growing religious group in America is none. I don't mean nuns like women with a habit. I mean N-O-N-E-S. I have no religion. Now, it might be that we're in the least God-curious generation of all humankind. And that's why I'm so particularly grateful that Pastor Amy has invited me to speak on behalf of the Jewish tradition in this series, Reaching for the Divine, because I know she puts God at the center of her ministry. The first time we ever met, we talked about God. It was over lunch. I was lamenting that my community seems rather embarrassed and uncomfortable about talking about God. She said, "We are too. But if we don't start talking about Jesus more, we might as well just join a Rotary Club and do good deeds." Well, I knew I liked Pastor Amy right away. She has become such a dear friend, an inspiring colleague, and a very powerful spiritual voice for our entire country. And so I'm so honored to be here to take part in this exquisite worship service that you've put together, to hear this choir, and to be in this historic church, so that I might be able to share with you a little bit about how we reach for the divine with Jewish vocabulary. It may surprise you to know that belief in God is certainly not a requirement of being a good Jew. Judaism has no specific dogma when it comes to God, and unlike Christian theology, where you have a God with skin on, as Pastor Amy described 2 weeks ago, Judaism doesn't really tell us what God is or what God looks like. And without an image to see in our minds or a body to relate to, a lot of Jews have a very hard time recognizing God in our lives. It's not a natural part of our vocabulary. I remember this last summer when a kindly Midwestern woman helped my husband find his cell phone, which he had dropped off the top of a mountain. The first words she uttered on seeing it were, "Praise the Lord," without a trace of irony. I knew right then, that is not a Jewish woman. But Judaism's lack of a God with skin on didn't stop our ancestors from trying to describe God in very human terms. God was loving, caring, protective. God could also be jealous and angry and vindictive. God is a healer, a parent, a judge, the Sabbath bride, our creator. But the problem with all these words and all these images is they can reduce God, the infinite, into something much smaller and more limited. Having an image of God can be helpful, but the quandary of God imagery is that it attempts to transform the experience of God, a divine presence, into a divine being. And so many of us have doubts about the existence and the nature of a divine being. But I think every one of us knows what it feels like to have an experience of the divine. We've each had those holy moments where we stumble against something wondrous or transcendent, something makes us marvel, chokes us up. We stop thinking and we just feel. We know we are profoundly connected to everything past, present, and future. These moments take us beyond ourselves and connect us to something much bigger. Judaism describes these sacred moments as when heaven and earth touch. It's not just that God endows us with these experiences. Judaism would say God is these experiences. Now, I have a vivid memory of the first time that I felt a sense of this divine connection. I was just 5 years old. I had just moved to Tacoma, Washington from my birthplace of Seoul, South Korea. It was not an easy transition. I missed my friends. I barely spoke any English. And it didn't help that my immigrant Korean mother would always put seaweed in my kindergarten lunchbox. Now, our first apartment in America happened to be right across the street from the one synagogue in Tacoma, the synagogue where my Jewish father and his father had all been raised. So I sometimes went along with him to Sabbath services on Friday nights, seeking to understand this new religion of mine in this new country I did not understand. Now, the only Hebrew I recognized was the prayer, the Shema, which is the watchword of our faith in Judaism, because we sang that prayer at bedtime. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, The Lord is God. God is one. God is one. Now, how's a 5-year-old supposed to understand what that means about God? I remember when I was in Korea, my Buddhist mother would meditate in front of a very nice smiling Buddha statue. His belly was full and friendly, and Buddha radiated happiness and calm. But this Jewish God had no face. All I had to work with was, the Lord is God. God is one. Help. But on this particular night, when I was 5, my father called me outside to watch a meteor shower. He lay down on a grassy courtyard right outside our apartment, and I laid right across his chest, on my back, both of us looking up into the night sky. And I kept impatiently asking, "Is that a shooting star?" "No." Wait, is that a shooting star?" "No." "Angela," he said, "just wait. Be still." And I calmed down into his heartbeat, and then I really suddenly saw the sky. Like, really saw it. It was all I could see, and it was thick with sparkling lights. And I felt so small and insignificant under this thick band of stars, and yet I knew I was part of it all. My father's breath, the grass beneath, the sky above. And then I marveled that this sky was the very same sky that stretched all the way across the world to my old home in Korea. Everything was connected. Sky, home, family, breath. God is one. It was a moment when heaven touched earth, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I'm sure you've all had those magical moments when it was as if yourself fell away and you really knew you were part of something much bigger than yourself. You might resist calling those moments God, but as Einstein said, science just can't explain the mystery of every seismic elation, every derailing grief, the ripple of relationship, the majesty of a pounding waterfall, or yes, a night sky. And when we are open to calling those experiences of connection God, well, then we can enter into an eternal conversation with our ancestors and our tradition. It's hard to be in dialogue with erosion. Now, if we call these moments God, we might more readily be able to recognize that in each of our traditions, God demands something of us. We are to seek God not only in the beautiful sanctuaries or even in the night sky, but to find God on the streets of our cities, in faces on the subway, in the kindness of a stranger who might be willing to help you find a phone on a mountaintop. God can be as simple as the moment that you can't describe, or just as hard. Judaism, especially without an incarnate God, invites us to recognize God in the many moments of unity, wonder, presence, healing, and connection that we already know. And to resist the urge to define God down to something tangible and explainable, to force God to play a recognizable character. Now, this is challenging for us Jews, the people of the book, because the Torah, our sacred scripture at the center of Jewish life, can sometimes itself be a stumbling block. Consider, for example, a story that we all share in our traditions, the well-known story of Adam and Eve, God's first encounter with human beings in the Bible. Now, God has placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which is a perfect paradise, to till and tend it. But God warns them, You can eat from any tree in the whole garden except for that really beautiful one right in the middle. That one's off limits. If you eat from it, the tree of knowledge, you will surely die. Now you know how this story plays out. A snake tempts Eve. Eve persuades Adam. And as soon as they eat from that tree of knowledge, they are suddenly aware of their nakedness, and they run and hide. And as punishment, God banishes them from the Garden of Eden. Now, the God depicted in this story, watchful, fully engaged in the matters of every human behavior, sometimes a little vengeful, this God is challenging to accept. This God that you might not believe in, I'll admit, I don't believe in either. But this biblical view of God is only one of many authentic ways that the Jewish tradition has suggested we might understand God. The Kabbalists, who are the Jewish mystics, offer a very different version of the story in the Zohar, which is the foundational book of Kabbalah. Now, the Kabbalists believe that one of God's names in Hebrew was Et, which is a Hebrew word made up of the first and the last letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the alpha and omega of the Hebrew language, encompassing all divine speech. So, while normally we would translate the Hebrew, Vayigaresh et ha'adam, to say, God expelled Adam from the garden, the Zohar translates it as, and he expelled God. Adam did. Did you get that? Adam expelled God from the Garden of Eden, according to the mystics. Now consider the implications of this reading. Human beings tasted from the fruit of knowledge, and we fell in love with knowledge. We elevated modern science and modern technology and modern rationality and reason above the beauty and simplicity that was in the garden. This became our new truth. We no longer had use for God. We no longer had time to recognize God, so we pushed God out. And perhaps we could have been satisfied to remain in the garden, living off the fat of the earth, content with our newly acquired knowledge. But at some point, we realized we were alone, and this knowledge was not enough. We realized that knowledge can explain how cancer cells reproduce in our bodies and maybe even help us find a cure, but it cannot assuage the terror and pain of the diagnosis or help us die with dignity and peace. This newfound knowledge could explain how the frequency of a sound wave determines its pitch, but it can't explain why hearing a great symphony makes us weep. The inadequacy of knowledge is that those truths can't teach us how to stretch the capacities of our hearts or how to live courageously in our suffering. Modern knowledge ignores our human yearning to reach beyond ourselves, to discover the purpose and the meaning of our lives. So as I read this Kabbalistic text, I realized human beings' greatest error was not in eating the fruit. Knowledge can be good. Our greatest error was in failing to realize that if God didn't exile us, guess where we are? We are still in the Garden of Eden. We are in paradise. And we have insufficient appreciation, insufficient humility, insufficient awe for the beauty and the mystery that is all around us every day. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, "Awe enables us to perceive in the world intimations of the divine, to sense in small things the beginning of infinite significance, to sense the ultimate in the common and simple." more than belief, more than deeds, more than faith, Heschel considers awe the primary religious outlook of a person, because it is awe that helps us recognize the intimations of the divine that are all around us. It was this awe that Einstein cultivated, even as he accessed more and more of the fruit of scientific knowledge. Awe cracks open heaven's gates so that we mere mortals might see where heaven and earth can touch. When we recognize that this beautiful world, far from perfect, offers us so many opportunities to reach for the divine, perhaps we might realize that God has been here in this beautiful garden with us all along. Amen.